I knew trouble was coming the second I saw Brenda Langston's beige SUV creeping up my driveway. Brenda was the HOA president, and if there was one thing I'd learned about her in the 6 months since she moved into town, it was that she had an unhealthy obsession with control. She wasn't from around here, she was one of those city types who thought a clipboard, and a scowl gave her dominion over everything in sight. I leaned against the red wooden fence, watching as she parked beside my barn, stepped out, and adjusted her blazer like she was about to step into a courtroom instead of my farm. Her short blonde bob barely moved in the wind, and her nose wrinkled like she smelled something foul. Probably fresh air. "Patricia," she said, her voice dripping with fake pleasantries. "I've been meaning to have a word with you." I kept my expression neutral. "Brenda." She glanced at my barn, a sturdy structure that had been standing for nearly 80 years. "This structure is in violation of HOA regulations." I blinked. "Come again." She pulled out a laminated document from her folder. "According to Section 12, Subsection 4 of the HOA Guidelines, all external buildings must adhere to approved design standards. Your barn is an unapproved structure. It needs to be removed." I let out a short laugh. "Brenda, this barn has been standing here since my grandfather built it. It's older than every house in this neighborhood." She pursed her lips. "Be that as it may, it doesn't match the aesthetic standards the HOA has set." I crossed my arms. "Brenda, you do realize that this is my land. You can't just declare a barn illegal because it doesn't fit your aesthetic." She gave me a tight, condescending smile. "Patricia, I understand change can be difficult, but the HOA is here to maintain property values. If you refuse to comply, we'll have to issue fines." I raised an eyebrow. "Fines?" "Yes. Starting at $500 per month until the structure is removed." I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Brenda, do you even know where you are right now?" She blinked. "Excuse me," I motioned around. "This isn't just my land. My family owns the entire county." Her mouth opened, then closed. That's not possible," I chuckled. "Oh, but it is. My great-grandfather settled this land. My grandfather expanded it, and my father made sure it stayed in the family. Every inch of this county, from the courthouse to the grocery store, is on land owned by my family." Brenda's face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Regardless of land ownership, you still fall under HOA jurisdiction." I shook my head. "No, Brenda, that's where you're wrong. My property isn't even in your HOA's jurisdiction." "Your paperwork is meaningless here." Her eye twitched. "I will take this up with the board." I smiled. "You do that." She spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV, but I could already see the wheels turning in her head. Brenda wasn't the type to back down easily. If she was coming for my barn, I knew she'd be back with more tricks up her sleeve. And if she thought I'd roll over, she had another thing coming. Brenda didn't waste any time. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I pulled back the curtain and saw two cars parked by my fence. One was Brenda's beige SUV. The other was a sleek black sedan I didn't recognize. I grabbed a fresh cup of coffee and stepped outside, boots crunching against the dirt as I made my way toward the unwelcome guests. Brenda stood beside a tall man in a navy blue suit, his silver-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he flipped through a thick binder. I didn't need an introduction to know what he was. A lawyer. Brenda's expression was all business. "Patricia, this is Mr. Daniel Henshaw, the HOA's legal counsel. We need to talk." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the steam rise between us. "I figured as much." Henshaw cleared his throat. "Miss Clayton, after reviewing the HOA bylaws and local zoning regulations, we have determined that your property, despite its historical background, falls under the jurisdiction of the Homeowners Association. The bylaws explicitly state that all structures must be approved by the board. Your barn is not." I studied him carefully. He was confident, assured in his authority. But there was something else, an eagerness, like he was already imagining the victory. I tilted my head. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? Brenda's lips curled slightly. If you refuse to comply, we will escalate this matter legally. First, with fines. Then, if necessary, through legal action to enforce removal. I let out a slow breath, not out of frustration, but to keep from laughing. You two really don't do your homework, do you? Henshaw blinked, clearly not used to being challenged so directly. I assure you, we've done extensive research. Then you should know that my property is legally exempt from any HOA regulations. Brenda folded her arms. That's debatable. I shook my head. No, it isn't. My family's land predates the formation of this HOA. It was never annexed into your jurisdiction, and therefore, your rules don't apply here. If you had done your due diligence, you'd know that. Henshaw's confident demeanor faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. Regardless, we have the authority to enforce community standards. I let out a soft chuckle. Go ahead and try. But before you do, I suggest you take a trip down to the county records office. You'll find that not only is this land exempt from your HOA's grip, but my family also holds the original land grants for this entire county. That includes the office you work out of, Brenda. And if I feel inclined, I can make things very difficult for you. Brenda's face turned an interesting shade of red. You're bluffing, I shrugged. Go check. Henshaw adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable. We will verify this information. You do that, I said, turning back toward my house. And while you're at it, I'd suggest finding a real case to chase, because this one is dead on arrival. Brenda's glare could have melted steel, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back to her SUV, Henshaw following behind her with noticeably less confidence than when he'd arrived. I watched them drive off, knowing full well that this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. If she couldn't get what she wanted through legal pressure, she'd find another way. And I'd be ready. Brenda and Henshaw didn't return that day, which told me one thing: they were scrambling. I knew exactly what they'd find when they went to the county records office. My land had been in my family's name for generations, untouched by any HOA jurisdiction. They were grasping at straws, and that meant they were desperate. Desperation made people reckless. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a drive into town. I had business at the feed store anyway, and I figured I'd swing by the county office to see if Brenda had made an appearance. Sure enough, her beige SUV was parked out front, looking out of place among the rusted pickups and work vans. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. Behind the counter sat Alice Parker, the county clerk, a woman who'd been managing records since before I was born. She was a no-nonsense type, sharp as a whip, and absolutely not the kind of person Brenda wanted to tangle with. Alice was leaning back in her chair, arms folded, while Brenda stood stiffly in front of her desk, an expression of growing irritation on her face. Henshaw was beside her, flipping through documents, his jaw tightening with each page. I took my time browsing the bulletin board near the entrance, listening in. Alice was speaking in that slow, deliberate way she used when she was dealing with someone who didn't understand the meaning of no. I don't know how else to say this, she said. The Clayton land was never incorporated into your HOA's jurisdiction. It's been privately held under a continuous land deed since before this town had paved roads. Your bylaws don't apply there. Brenda's voice was clipped. There must be some kind of mistake. Alice let out a short laugh. The only mistake is you thinking you have any authority over property you don't own. Henshaw cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. Perhaps there's a legal precedent for annexation. Alice tapped a manicured nail against the desk. Not without the owner's consent. And in case you missed it, Patricia Clayton isn't the consenting type. Brenda's hands curled into fists. So you're telling me there's absolutely no way to bring that property into compliance? Alice leaned forward. That's exactly what I'm telling you. I decided that was my cue. Stepping forward, I let my boots hit the wooden floor with enough weight to make them turn. "Afternoon, Alice," I said. Alice's face lit up. "Well, if it isn't Patricia Clayton." "You looking to file anything today?" I smiled. "Not today. Just came to see if Brenda here had finally figured out she's fighting a losing battle." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over," I shrugged. "Seems pretty over to me." Henshaw, clearly realizing they were out of options, shut his binder with a sigh. "Come on, Brenda. We're wasting time." Brenda shot me one last look before turning on her heel and marching out of the office, her lawyer trailing behind. Alice chuckled, shaking her head. She really thought she could bulldoze her way through county law. I leaned on the counter. "She's not the type to give up easy. I doubt this is the last stunt she'll pull." Alice nodded. "You let me know if she tries anything shady. I know a few commissioners who'd love to have a word with her." I thanked her and headed back out to my truck. By the time I got home, I had a feeling in my gut that Brenda wasn't done. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I threw on my boots and stormed outside, heart hammering. There, parked right at the edge of my property line, was a construction crew. A backhoe idled beside them, and standing in front of it, clipboard in hand, was Brenda. She turned when she saw me, her expression smug. I stopped short, hands on my hips. "What do you think you're doing?" She gestured toward the crew. "We're installing a new HOA fence. It appears the property lines weren't properly marked before." "We're just fixing that." I laughed, loud and sharp. "You're joking." She held up her clipboard. "The HOA has the authority to ensure property boundaries are properly delineated. Since your land butts up against our community, we're making sure everything is correctly sectioned off." I stepped forward, voice low and serious. "You step 1 inch onto my property with that fence and you're going to wish you hadn't." Brenda's eyes gleamed. "Are you threatening me?" I shook my head. "No, Brenda, I'm stating a fact. You have no authority here. If you try to build anything on my land, I'll make sure the county slaps you with so many legal violations, you won't know which way is up." She waved a dismissive hand. "The surveyor confirmed this is HOA land." I narrowed my eyes. "Which surveyor?" She hesitated. I nodded. "That's what I thought." Pulling out my phone, I dialed a number and put it on speaker. A gruff voice answered. "County Surveyor's Office." "Hey, Jim, it's Patricia Clayton. Got a quick question for you. Did anyone from the HOA request a property survey recently?" There was a pause. "Nope. Last recorded survey on your land was 5 years ago. No changes since then." I smiled, eyes locked on Brenda. "Thanks, Jim. That's all I needed." I hung up and crossed my arms. "Seems like you lied, Brenda." Again. Her face darkened. I turned to the construction crew. "Unless you want to be personally liable for property damage, I suggest you pack up and leave." The foreman hesitated, then turned to Brenda. "Ma'am," Brenda seethed but knew she was caught. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stomped back to her car. The crew didn't wait for her to argue. Within minutes, they were loading up their equipment and rolling out. I watched them go, shaking my head. Brenda had just made a critical mistake. She tried to encroach on my land, and now I had grounds to take legal action against her personally. If she thought she was in control, she was about to learn the hard way that she had picked the wrong fight. Brenda's latest stunt had crossed a line. Trying to build on my land wasn't just an overreach, it was illegal. She had no jurisdiction, no survey, no legal justification. She had shown her hand, and now it was my turn. I spent the next few hours gathering everything I needed. I pulled out the original land deeds, the most recent county surveys, and every document proving the HOA had no authority here. Then I made a few calls. First was to the county commissioner, an old friend of my father's. He listened carefully as I laid out what had happened: the unauthorized crew, the boundary dispute, the blatant disregard for property law. He assured me he'd escalate the issue immediately. Next, I contacted a lawyer, someone well-versed in property disputes. He didn't even hesitate before agreeing to take my case. If Brenda wanted a legal battle, I was more than happy to oblige. By the time evening rolled around, I was sitting on my porch when a pickup truck pulled into my driveway. It was my neighbor, Robert, a retired sheriff who had lived in these parts longer than anyone. He stepped out, shaking his head. "I heard what that HOA woman tried to pull," he said. "Folks in town are talking," I nodded. "She's getting desperate." Robert leaned against the railing, his weathered hands gripping the wood. "Desperate people make mistakes." "You planning to let this slide?" "Not a chance," he grinned. "Good, because I'm not the only one who's fed up. A few of us are thinking it's time to push back. Brenda's been throwing her weight around too much, even with folks who actually live under her rules." That was interesting. I hadn't been paying close attention to how she was treating the other homeowners, but if Robert was bringing it up, it meant there was more going on than just her coming after me. "She's got them scared," he continued. "Issuing fines left and right, making up violations. People are tired of it, but they don't know how to fight back." I considered that. Brenda had been treating the HOA like her personal kingdom, and now she was trying to expand it beyond its limits. But if the people she actually had authority over were turning against her, that opened up an opportunity. "Think they'd be willing to speak out?" I asked. Robert nodded. "If they knew someone had their back, yeah." That gave me an idea. The next morning, I drove into town and started knocking on doors. The first few residents were hesitant, but as soon as I mentioned Brenda's overreach, their frustration spilled out. One woman, an elderly widow named Mrs. Thompson, showed me a stack of bogus fines Brenda had issued, everything from improperly maintained flower beds to excessive front porch decorations. Another resident, a young father named Greg, told me how the HOA had nearly forced him to remove the swing set in his backyard because it didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. Everywhere I went, I heard the same thing: Brenda was making up rules, enforcing them selectively, and bullying people into compliance. By the time I finished, I had more than enough people willing to speak out. That evening, I called a meeting at the community center, inviting every homeowner who had been affected by Brenda's antics. To my surprise, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. I stood at the front, looking out at the faces of people who were tired of being pushed around. "We all know why we're here," I began. "Brenda has been abusing her authority, and it's time we do something about it." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Greg stood up. "She fined me $300 for leaving my trash cans out a few hours past pickup time. Meanwhile, her own driveway was covered in weeds for months." Mrs. Thompson held up her stack of fines. "I don't even know what half of these are for. She's just making things up." A woman in the back raised her hand. "Can we remove her?" That was the real question, and I had come prepared with an answer. "Yes," I said. "HOA boards are elected positions. If enough of you vote, you can replace her with someone who actually has your best interests in mind." The room came alive with chatter. People were excited now, realizing they had power. Robert stood up. "We've got enough people here to call for a vote. Let's do it." I nodded. "We'll need to follow the proper procedure, but with this many people backing it, she won't be able to ignore it." We spent the next hour organizing. Petitions were signed, complaints were documented, and by the end of the night, we had everything we needed to force a recall vote. The next morning, we marched into the HOA office, papers in hand. Brenda was inside, sitting behind her desk like a queen on her throne. When she saw the crowd behind me, her eyes narrowed. "What is this?" she demanded. I placed the petition on her desk. "A recall vote. You've lost the community's confidence, Brenda. It's time for you to step down." She scanned the papers, her face growing redder by the second. "This is ridiculous." "I will not be intimidated by a mob." Robert stepped forward. "This isn't intimidation, it's democracy." Brenda's hands trembled as she flipped through the signatures. There were too many for her to ignore. "You can't do this," she hissed. "I've done nothing wrong," Greg spoke up. "You've done nothing but make people's lives miserable. We're done with your power trips." She looked at Henshaw, who was standing behind her, but even he seemed to realize it was over. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. The petition meets the legal threshold, he admitted. A vote must be held. Brenda clenched her jaw, but she knew she had lost. I met her eyes, my voice calm. You thought you could control everything, but you forgot one thing, Brenda. This community isn't yours to rule. She said nothing. The vote was held a week later. By an overwhelming majority, Brenda was removed from her position. As she packed up her office, she refused to look at anyone. The same people she had bullied now watched as she cleared out, relieved to see her go. When she finally walked out the door, she paused, turning to glare at me one last time. You think you've won, she muttered. I smiled. I know I have. She got into her SUV and drove off, leaving behind a neighborhood that was finally free from her grip. With Brenda gone, the HOA elected a new board, one that actually cared about the community. The bogus fines were revoked, the rules were re-evaluated, and for the first time in a long time, people felt like they had a say in their own homes. As for my barn, it's still standing, just like it always has, and it always will. Brenda had been ousted, but I knew better than to assume she would go quietly. People like her didn't just slink away in defeat, they plotted, schemed, and waited for another opportunity to seize control. So, while the neighborhood celebrated her removal, I kept my eyes open. The new HOA board wasted no time undoing the damage she had caused. They rolled back the arbitrary fines and revised the ridiculous regulations that had made life miserable for so many residents. People finally had a say in their own homes again. But even with Brenda gone from the board, I had a feeling she wasn't entirely done with her games. 2 weeks after her removal, I got confirmation of that suspicion. I had just finished repairing a section of my fence when Robert pulled up in his truck, dust swirling in the late afternoon sun. He climbed out, his expression unreadable, and leaned on the hood while I set my tools down. He wasted no time getting to the point. Brenda had been spotted at the county courthouse, talking with a land developer. Not just any developer, either. She had gone straight to one of the largest real estate firms in the state. The kind that didn't bother with small projects. That set off every alarm in my head. Brenda had lost her position, lost her ability to control the HOA, but if she was now working with developers, that meant she was trying something bigger. I wiped the sweat off my brow, thinking it through. Land developers didn't just show up for no reason. If Brenda had reached out to them, it meant she was trying to push for something drastic. I needed to find out exactly what she was up to. The next morning, I drove into town and went straight to the county records office. Alice, the county clerk, greeted me with a knowing look before I even said a word. She already knew why I was there. She led me to her desk and pulled out a file. Inside was a preliminary proposal submitted by Brenda requesting a zoning change for the land bordering my property. That was all I needed to see. Brenda wasn't just trying to weasel back into power, she was trying to get the entire area rezoned, likely to make way for a massive development project. If she succeeded, it would mean high-density housing, commercial lots, and worst of all, a legal avenue for the HOA to expand its reach. She was trying to change the game entirely. I tapped the papers, my mind already racing through possibilities. Changing zoning laws wasn't an overnight process, but Brenda knew how to manipulate people. She must have convinced the developers that she could push it through. Alice watched me closely. She didn't have to say it outright, but I knew she was on my side. Still, there were limits to what she could do. This wasn't just about me anymore. If Brenda got her way, it wouldn't just be my land at risk, it would affect the entire community. I needed to stop this before it gained traction. I spent the next few days gathering information. I spoke with the county commissioner, the planning office, and a few local business owners who would also be affected if Brenda's plan went through. Everything pointed to one thing: she was trying to push the proposal through quietly before anyone could mount an opposition. She had underestimated me. 3 days later, the county held a public hearing to discuss the zoning proposal. The meeting room was packed. Residents filled every seat, and more stood along the walls. Word had spread fast, and no one was happy about the idea of a massive development taking over their town. Brenda was there, sitting at the front beside a man in a tailored suit, the developer's representative. She had dressed sharply, exuding the same false confidence she had always carried when she ran the HOA. I took a seat near the back, watching as the hearing unfolded. The developer presented their case first, painting a picture of progress and economic growth. They talked about job creation, increased property values, and the supposed benefits of modernization. Then Brenda spoke. She framed it as a necessary step forward, claiming that the town needed better organization and that a more structured residential plan would help maintain community standards. I could practically hear the disgust in the room. When it was time for public comments, I stood up and made my way to the front. The room quieted as I took the microphone. I didn't waste time. I laid out exactly what was happening, how Brenda had no authority to speak on behalf of the community, how the HOA had already overstepped its bounds, and how this entire proposal was nothing more than a power grab disguised as progress. Then I hit them with the real kicker. I produced the original land deeds and historical records, proving that my family's ownership of the surrounding land predated any zoning changes. The proposal couldn't move forward without my consent, and I wasn't giving it. The room erupted. Residents cheered, furious that they had nearly been blindsided by Brenda's latest scheme. The county officials exchanged glances, clearly realizing that this was a fight they didn't want to be part of. The developer's representative looked uneasy, sensing that their project was dead in the water. Brenda, however, looked livid. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and stormed toward me. She tried to regain control, claiming that I was obstructing progress, that I was holding the town back. I simply raised an eyebrow and motioned toward the crowd, the very people she claimed to be helping. Not a single person supported her. She had lost. The county officials officially rejected the proposal that evening. Brenda left without another word, her face a mask of barely concealed rage. The developer pulled out of the project entirely. The town was safe, and as I watched Brenda drive away, I knew that she had just run out of moves. Brenda's defeat should have been the end of it, but I knew better. People like her didn't just give up, they festered, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. But after the zoning proposal collapsed and the HOA was freed from her grip, she had no more leverage. At least not legally. That didn't mean she wouldn't try something else. For the next week, things were quiet, too quiet. The neighborhood was finally settling into a sense of peace, and folks were happy to be rid of her. But I kept my guard up. Brenda had been humiliated publicly, legally, and socially. And someone like her wouldn't just pack up and leave town. Then the trouble started. It began with little things. My mail went missing. Packages I'd ordered never arrived. A few times, I spotted unfamiliar cars parked just down the road from my property, watching. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then I noticed my fence had been tampered with, sections of it left open that I never left open myself. It wasn't just me either. Robert called one morning, telling me his work truck had been mysteriously vandalized overnight. Greg mentioned that his backyard gate had been found wide open, despite him locking it every night. Mrs. Thompson's garbage bins had been knocked over repeatedly, even though there was no wind or animals around to cause it. It was petty. Small things meant to unsettle us. But I knew who was behind it. Brenda had lost her power in an official capacity, but she was still trying to make people miserable. If she couldn't control the neighborhood with rules, she'd do it through intimidation. That's when I decided to put an end to it once and for all. I installed new security cameras, hidden ones, placed strategically around my property. I made sure Robert and Greg did the same. If Brenda thought she could keep playing games, she was about to learn that we weren't going to just sit back and take it. It didn't take long before we caught her in the act. 3 nights later, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside. I checked the cameras and saw a shadowy figure creeping along my fence line. The feed was clear as day. It was Brenda. She was dressed in black, hunched over trying to pry open one of my fence posts. I grabbed my flashlight, my phone, and stepped outside. Brenda didn't hear me approach. She was too busy fiddling with something at the base of my fence. But when I flicked on the flashlight, the beam caught her right in the face. She froze like a deer caught in headlights. Her usually polished appearance was gone. Her hair was pulled back messily, and her expression was wild, desperate. I didn't say a word right away. I just let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. Then she straightened, trying to regain her composure. She started throwing excuses, spinning lies, but I didn't let her finish. I pulled out my phone and showed her the security footage, clear, undeniable evidence of her trespassing on my property. Her face drained of color. She tried to argue, to claim she was just making sure everything was secure for the neighborhood, but there was no way out of it. That's when I gave her a choice. She could either pack up and leave town, or I would press charges for trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. And with the footage I had, she wouldn't just be facing fines, she'd be facing real legal consequences. For the first time, Brenda had no snappy retort, no manipulative comeback. She was beaten. The next morning, her house was listed for sale. Within days, she was gone. The neighborhood finally breathed easy. She had tried everything: legal loopholes, intimidation, and underhanded tactics. But in the end, she had lost, and my barn, it still stood just like it had for generations, unmoved, unbothered. Just like me.